What would happen if all African immigrants left Europe, left the USA, left Canada? Of course, it's going to have an economic and a social and even a cultural effect in the countries that they live in. So that's what we want to talk about today, particularly the economic effect, so that we can debunk the narrative that immigrants, and not just African immigrants, are a burden, that they don't provide any economic value, that they are just taking away jobs that are meant for the native population. Let's look at the hard numbers so that we can understand the profiles of these African immigrants. There was a survey that was done in 2020, and it was discovered that around 11 million African immigrants live in Europe. Then we had about 5 million immigrants in the Asian region. So here we're talking about UAE, we're talking about Qatar, and we had around 3 million immigrants, African immigrants, in the Northern American region. So we're talking about USA, Canada, and these other countries. Now let's break this information further to understand which countries have the most number of African immigrants. In Europe, France is at the top, 8%. Then we have the UK that takes the share of 3%. And then we have these other countries like Italy, Spain, Germany, Netherlands that take another share of these African immigrants. And we go ahead and break this information further to understand which country in Africa exports, allow me to say that, exports most Africans, exports African labor. And at the top we have Egypt, then we have Morocco, then we have South Sudan, we have Somalia, we have Algeria, the DRC, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, and when you continue going down, you'll come across Kenya, somewhere there. Kenya, South Africa, Ghana. But these are the top African countries where African immigrants in Europe come from. And you'll notice that countries like Egypt, Morocco, we have Algeria. These are countries that are in the northern part of Africa. So they border the Mediterranean Sea, which then borders Europe. So it makes sense. It makes sense why majority of the Africans are there, because you can just cross the Mediterranean Sea and you find yourself in Spain. You find yourself in Italy. Now, there was this research that was done in 2020 again, on immigrants, and this is what was discovered, that African immigrants are not mostly uneducated single men looking for welfare coverage. No, they are mostly young people, educated people looking for jobs. Almost half of them are women. And around 80% of African migrations are driven by the search for better economic prospects. And even further, 7.2% of African migrants in EU countries are refugees. So you can see that a small share of these African migrants are refugees. Remember some of the countries that I just shown you before. We had countries like Somalia, we had countries like the DRC, South Sudan, specifically countries that are war-torn areas. And you'll find that part of these African immigrants who are living from those regions are seeking asylum. They're going for safety. And 7.2% of these African immigrants in EU countries are refugees. So a huge chunk of these people, that is around 80% of migrations, are driven by the search of economic prospects. It's important that we understand that we highlight that, because it shows the purpose of an African immigrant who is going to the UK, of the African immigrant who is going to Spain, to Italy. They're not going there with the aim of just enjoying the social welfare systems. They're going there to work, to have a better life. And that is the mindset of building an economy. That if you're going to another country to work, in as much as you're building yourself, you're also building the economy of this country. Now let's go to the US. There was this study that was done in 2012. It was actually a survey, and they discovered that, listen to this, the Black immigrant population increased by a notable 23.5%. That is from 3.5 million in 2012 to 4.3 million in 2022. Now, these are Black immigrant populations. These are not specifically people coming from Africa, because when we break this down further, you're going to understand that we have people of the African origin that are in Jamaica, that are in Haiti, yet they are not in Africa. But majority of these Black immigrants come from Jamaica, that is in the US, followed by Haiti. Then now we have Nigeria. Nigeria, They're taking a huge share of Africans in the US. Then we have Ethiopia. Then we had Ghana. Then we have Trinidad. These ones are not in Africa. And here comes Kenya. Now let's break this information further so that you understand the occupations that these African immigrants have. Again, it's important that we understand where they're working, which sectors and industries that they're working in. You're going to notice that majority of these Black immigrant workers are registered nurses, nursing assistants, driver, that is sales workers and truck drivers. We have personal care aides, we have taxi drivers, we have home health aides, customer service representatives. So majority of these African immigrants work in the healthcare industry and in the transportation industry. So think about mass deportation. Just think about that. It will definitely affect these industries. Now, there was this article that was done by the New York Times. It was done about 3 days ago. I'm going to leave a link to that so that you check it out. It was talking about how President Donald Trump has started to shift focus on mass deportation on certain areas and industries. In fact, listen to this. The Trump administration has abruptly shifted the focus of mass deportation campaign, telling immigration and custom enforcement officials to largely pause raids and arrests in the agricultural industry, in the hotels and restaurants industry. So what does that communicate? And this is just recent news that immigrants, and not just African immigrants, support these industries, support the agricultural and the hotel and restaurant industries in the US. In fact, there's this fear that businesses in these industries, that they're going to suffer because there's going to be labor shortage. Now, back to the profile of African immigrants. There was this research that was done in 2015. It was comparing the level of education for people who are 25 years and above, and they were comparing the native population and also the immigrant population, like how does their college education level look like. It was discovered that in the sub-Saharan Africa, the study was mainly on the sub-Saharan part of Africa, so we're talking about countries that are in the southern part of the Sahara Desert. Okay, so we're not talking about Algeria, Egypt. We're mainly talking about these other countries, Kenya, South Africa, West Africa. So immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa, ages 25 years and older in the US, not only stood out from those in Europe, but they also were more likely than the overall US-born population to have at least some college experience. And the numbers are 69% for the immigrants and 63% for the native-born Americans. And it was also a similar pattern that was seen in the UK and in Portugal. You can see that in the UK, it's also a similar case where we have 49% for the immigrants and 30% for the native-born population, and also a similar figure for Portugal. So you see that the labor that we are exporting as Africa to the Western countries, it's labor that is skilled, it's labor that is educated. So somebody who's going there to grind, to hustle, to work and improve their livelihood is somebody who at least has attained a college level education. Now back to that scenario, that what if there was a mass deportation, or all African immigrants left Europe, left the USA. In fact, let's go further and say, what if all immigrants would leave these countries? There would be labor shortages. You've seen that in the US, most immigrants support the agricultural industry. They support the hospitality industry, the healthcare industry. And it's also the case in these European countries where we have most African immigrants who are doing jobs in the healthcare industry, in the transportation industry, in the sanitation industry, and also in the tech industry. Yes, we are exporting skilled labor to these countries. The other effect would be on tax contribution. Let me just show you some numbers here. In 2021, the economic output of immigrants, African immigrants, was around 176 billion USD. This was the output. We had around 48 billion that was contributed as taxes from the African immigrant population from the African immigrant workers. Now think about Europe. We have low birth rates. Let me just show you a quick figure of how the live births for the EU looks like. You can see that there's a linear graph here. It's going down. It's been going down. And these are the number of live births since 1961 to 2022. That in 1960, there were around, let's say, 6.8 million children born in Europe. And you can see that in 2023, let me just say 2020. In 2020, there were around 4 million live births, children who are being born. You can see that the graph is going down. And considering the fact that in the years, that is the 1960s, where most children were being born, and that we have people who are living longer in Europe. So this population that was born in the 1960s and even prior to that are living longer. You can now imagine that the fact that they have an aging population and they need pension, they need to be supported by pension. Of course, there's the native population, but African immigrants work in these countries. They contribute to the taxes of these countries. They contribute to the pensions that currently support this aging population. Of course, we are not a permanent solution. We are a temporary solution, but even that temporary solution makes a difference. There was a study that was done by an MIT economist, and according to this study, he found out that immigrants in the US are more likely to start farms, create jobs, compared to native-born citizens. Immigrants are more frequently involved in founding companies at all scales. Of course, this does not specifically tie to the African immigrants, but immigrants in general, and a percentage of them are African immigrants. This is just something about being an immigrant. You remember that study, the first study that was done, where when immigrants are leaving their countries, when there's that Kenyan who's going to the US, who's going to Australia, who's going to Qatar, when they're going there with the aim of making money. It comes from a point of lack. When you lack something and you get an opportunity to make something out of it, you want to max it out. And I think it's the resilience that immigrants in general have. Now, having shown you all that, don't you find it hypocritical that there can be a narrative that immigrants are a burden, that immigrants siphon the resources of a country? Yet, what we've seen is that they grow the economy of the country that they are hosted in. Is that narrative justified, or is it xenophobia? Because as we've seen, it's a symbiotic relationship, that Africa has an issue of unemployment and the countries in the West have a shortage of labor, and we are swapping all that everybody gets to benefit. Let's continue this conversation in the comments.